The summer I turned 13, I
This
thought I
fossil
knew
doesn't
everything
just
about
raise
digging
questions.
holes. I'd
An
spent
unknown
countless
ancestor.
afternoons in our dusty backyard in Thessaloniki, excavating what I was certain were ancient artifacts but usually
Is
turned
this
out to be
convergence
bottle
or
caps or
connection?
rusty nails.
This species didn't
My
just
mother would
survive.
shake her head and mutter
It
about the mess I
adapted.
made, but my father, well, Papa understood. He was the one who first told me about the bones sleeping beneath Greek soil, waiting centuries for someone curious enough to find them. It was 1975, and Greece felt like it was waking up from a long, troubled sleep. The military junta had fallen the year before, and there was this electric feeling in the air, like anything might be possible again. Papa worked for the Archaeological Service, which sounds more impressive than it was. Mostly he drove professors around in his battered blue truck and helped them carry their equipment to dig sites scattered across northern Greece. But Papa loved the work, loved being part of discoveries that stretched back millions of years, and he infected me with that same fever. That's how I found myself bouncing along a dirt road outside Thessaloniki on a scorching July morning, wedged between Papa and a French professor named Dr. de Bonis, who smelled like tobacco and spoke Greek with an accent that made me bite my cheek to keep from laughing. In the truck bed behind us, shovels and pickaxes rattled against wooden crates filled with brushes, measuring tools, and plaster for making casts. Dr. de Bonis had been working in the area for a few years already, searching for fossils in the reddish sediments that locals called ponchon after some ancient sea that used to cover this land. "Tell me again why we're looking for monkey bones," I said to Papa in Greek, loud enough that Dr. de Bonis could hear. The Frenchman had been trying to explain his work to me, but between his accent and my 13-year-old attention span, I'd only caught pieces. Papa shot me a warning look, but Dr. de Bonis chuckled. "Not just any monkey bones, young Nikos," he said, switching to his careful Greek. "We are looking for our ancestors. The creatures that came before humans, before your great-great-great," he waved his hand in a circle, many times great-grandparents. I'd heard about this evolution business, of course. It wasn't something they taught much in school, especially not during the junta years, but Papa had shown me pictures in foreign magazines of skeleton displays in museums, charts showing how apes gradually stood upright and grew bigger brains. The Orthodox priest in our neighborhood had strong opinions about such things, but Papa always said the earth itself was God's book, and we were just learning to read it. The truck lurched over a particularly deep rut, and I grabbed the door handle to steady myself. Through the windshield, I could see our destination, a low hillside dotted with oak trees, where the red earth showed through like wounds in the summer brown grass. It didn't look like much, but Papa had explained that millions of years ago, this had been a lush forest full of creatures that no longer existed. Sometimes when I tried to picture it, I imagined our familiar landscape suddenly teeming with strange animals, like someone had mixed up a nature documentary with a fairy tale. We pulled up beside two other vehicles, a dusty Land Rover and another pickup truck that had seen better days. A small camp had been established in the shade of the largest oak tree, folding tables covered with notebooks and small tools, a couple of canvas chairs, and a cooler that I hoped contained something cold to drink. 3 other people were already at work, bent over what looked like a shallow crater they dug into the hillside. "Ah, Louis," called a woman with sun-bleached hair tied back in a kerchief. She straightened up and waved a small brush at Dr. de Bonis. "Come see what we found yesterday." I followed Papa and the professor toward the dig site, my sneakers sliding a little on the loose dirt. The woman, Dr. Milentis, Papa had told me was Greek but had studied in England, which explained why she sometimes slipped into English when she got excited. She was pointing to something in the dirt that looked like nothing more than a small, dark rock to me. "Tooth," she said, switching to Greek for my benefit. Definitely primate, but the size. She shook her head. It's larger than anything we've found before. Dr. DeBonis knelt beside the excavation, pulling a magnifying glass from his shirt pocket. I crowded closer, ignoring Papa's gentle hand on my shoulder that suggested I should give the adults space. In the careful circle they'd exposed, I could now see what they were looking at, a dark, triangular shape embedded in the red sediment, no bigger than my thumbnail but somehow radiating importance. How old? Dr. DeBonis murmured, still peering through his magnifying glass. The sediment layer suggests 8 to 9 million years, replied a bearded man I hadn't met yet. He spoke with an American accent and had the deep tan of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. If the dating holds up, this could be significant. I knew enough from Papa's dinner table stories to understand that finding old bones was only part of the puzzle. The real trick was figuring out exactly how old they were, which meant understanding the layers of rock and dirt like pages in a book. Each layer told a story about what the climate was like, what plants and animals lived there, even what the continents looked like. It was better than any adventure novel, Papa always said, because it was real. The adults continued their discussion, using words I only half understood: cranial capacity, dental morphology, phylogenetic relationships. I let their voices fade into background noise and focused on the dig site itself. Someone had strung up a tarp to provide shade, and beneath it, the earth had been divided into precise squares marked with string and metal stakes. Each square had a number written on a small wooden tag, and every tool had its place on the tables. It was like a laboratory that happened to be outdoors, where instead of test tubes and microscopes, they used brushes and sieves and endless patience. Want to help? Dr. Milentus had noticed me staring and was holding out a soft bristled brush. We need to clear more sediment from around the tooth before we can remove it. I looked at Papa, who nodded encouragingly. Dr. Milentus showed me how to hold the brush, how to make gentle sweeping motions that would clear away dirt without disturbing whatever might be buried beneath. It was surprisingly difficult. Every instinct told me to brush harder, faster, but she kept reminding me that we had all the time in the world. The fossil had waited millions of years, it could wait a little longer. As I worked, she told me about the creatures that used to live in this area. 8 or 9 million years ago, Greece had been much warmer and wetter, covered in dense forests full of animals that seemed like something from a dream. There were primitive elephants with 4 tusks, giant tortoises the size of coffee tables, and saber-toothed cats that hunted in the shadows. And somewhere among them were the ancestors of humans, not quite apes, not quite people, but something in between. The problem, Dr. Milentus explained as I carefully brushed sediment from around a small dark shape that might have been another bone fragment, is that we have very few fossils from this time period. It's like trying to read a book when most of the pages are missing. Every new discovery helps us fill in the gaps. The sun climbed higher, and the work became hypnotic. Brush, examine, photograph, measure, record. Each tiny fragment had to be documented before it could be moved. I learned that what looked like random rocks to me were actually pieces of an ancient world, fragments of jaw bones, teeth, sometimes whole skulls if we were lucky. Dr. DeBonis showed me how to spot the difference between fossil bone and the surrounding rock, how the mineral replacement process had turned living tissue into stone while preserving its shape. By lunchtime, we'd exposed several more fragments around the original tooth. Dr. Milentus carefully painted each piece with a thin layer of consolidant to strengthen it before removal, while the American professor Dr. Kelly, I'd learned, sketched the entire assemblage in a field notebook. Everything had to be recorded in multiple ways: drawings, photographs, measurements, written descriptions. Science, I was beginning to understand, was mostly about being very, very careful. We ate our lunch in the shade of the oak tree, and Papa shared the sandwiches Mama had packed, thick slices of bread with tomatoes and feta cheese, and cold bottles of Coca-Cola that had somehow survived the morning heat. Dr. DeBonis produced a thermos of coffee that was probably strong enough to wake the dead, and soon the adults were deep in conversation about grant applications and publishing schedules and academic politics that went completely over my head. But I was more interested in Dr. Kelly's field notebook, which he'd left open on the table. His drawings were incredibly detailed, showing not just the bones they'd found but the exact position of each fragment, the angle of the rock layers, even the nearby roots and stones. In the margins, he'd written notes about measurements and observations, sometimes switching between English and what looked like scientific Latin. "You like the drawings?" Dr. Kelly had noticed my interest and slid the notebook closer to me. "Field sketching is one of the most important skills in paleontology. Photographs are good, but they can't capture everything the human eye sees." He showed me other pages from previous days' sketches of fossil fragments, geological cross-sections, even detailed drawings of the tools they used. Each page was like a window into their work, and I found myself wishing I could draw half as well. "The key," Dr. Kelly continued, "is to draw what you see, not what you think you should see. Our brains like to fill in missing pieces, to make patterns where none exist. But in science, we have to be honest about what's actually there." After lunch, they decided to expand the excavation around the tooth. If it was part of a larger skull, there might be more fragments nearby. Papa and I helped remove the layers of soil above the fossil-bearing sediment while the scientists worked on the delicate excavation itself. It was hot, sweaty work, and more than once I found myself wondering why anyone would choose to spend their summer vacation digging holes in the Greek countryside. But then Dr. Milentis called out excitedly from her section of the dig, "Louis, come see this." We all crowded around as she carefully brushed sediment away from what was clearly another fossil fragment, this one larger than the tooth and curved like part of a bowl. Dr. DeBonis examined it through his magnifying glass, then looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Cranial fragment," he said quietly. "Possibly frontal bone." The implications hit me even before the adults started talking. If they'd found pieces of a skull, that meant this wasn't just another random fossil animal. This could be one of those missing links Papa had told me about, a creature that would help scientists understand how apes became humans. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of careful excavation and growing excitement. As more fragments emerged from the red sediment, the scientists' voices became more animated, switching between Greek, English, and French as they debated what they were seeing. Dr. DeBonis kept consulting a battered field guide to primate anatomy, comparing the fossils to illustrations of modern ape skulls. By late afternoon, they'd exposed what appeared to be substantial portions of a skull, along with several teeth and possibly part of a jawbone. The heat was beginning to fade, and long shadows stretched across the dig site as they prepared to document everything before the day ended. "Tomorrow we'll start making the jacket," Dr. Milentis explained to me as she carefully covered the exposed fossils with damp newspaper. "We can't just pull them out of the ground, the bone is too fragile. Instead, we'll cover everything with plaster bandages, like a cast for a broken arm, and remove the whole block. Then we can work on it properly in the laboratory." I watched as they covered the site with tarps and secured everything for the night. It seemed strange to just walk away and leave such an important discovery sitting in the ground, but Papa explained that the fossils had waited millions of years already. One more night wouldn't matter. The drive back to Thessaloniki was quieter than the morning trip. Dr. Debona sat in the passenger seat making notes in a small notebook, occasionally muttering to himself in French. Papa concentrated on the increasingly rutted road, while I stared out the window and tried to imagine what the creature looked like when it was alive. Had it walked upright like a human? Did it use tools? Could it have been one of my ancestors, however distant? That evening, Papa and I sat on our small balcony overlooking the neighborhood while Mama cooked dinner inside. The familiar sounds of the city traffic, voices, someone's radio playing folk music seemed somehow different after a day spent thinking about creatures that lived before humans even existed. "Papa," I said finally, "do you think we really found something important today?" He was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee and watching the sunset behind the apartment buildings across the street. "I think," he said carefully, "that Dr. Debonis and his team found something that will make them very excited. Whether it's as important as they hope." He shrugged. "That's for smarter people than me to decide." But I could tell he thought it was important. Papa had been around enough archaeological digs to recognize when the scientists got that particular look in their eyes, the one that said they'd stumbled onto something bigger than they'd expected. The next morning, we returned to the site to find Dr. Debonis already there, talking animatedly on a radio phone he'd somehow managed to connect. He was speaking in French, but his tone suggested he was reporting the discovery to colleagues somewhere. When he saw us approaching, he switched to Greek and signed off. "I've been in contact with the university," he explained. "They're sending additional team members, and we'll need to expand the excavation. If this is what we think it is." He trailed off, but his excitement was obvious. The process of removing the fossils was even more meticulous than their discovery had been. First, Dr. Milentis carefully cleaned around each fragment with fine brushes and dental picks, exposing as much of the bone as possible without actually removing it from the sediment. Then she painted everything with more consolidant and waited for it to dry. Meanwhile, Dr. Kelly worked on documenting everything. He took dozens of photographs from different angles, made detailed measurements, and filled several pages with field sketches. Every fragment was numbered and its position recorded on a detailed site map that showed the exact location of each find. "Why so much paperwork?" I asked as I watched him record what seemed like the 100th measurement of the day. "Because once we remove these fossils, we can never put them back exactly as we found them," he explained. "All this documentation is the only way future scientists will know how the bones were positioned relative to each other, what kind of sediment they were found in, and what other fossils were nearby. That context is almost as important as the bones themselves." The actual jacketing process was fascinating to watch. They mixed plaster of Paris with water in a plastic bucket until it had the consistency of thick soup, then soaked strips of burlap in the mixture. These went over the top of the fossil-bearing block, building up layer after layer until the whole thing was encased in a white shell several inches thick. "It's like making a mummy," I observed, which made Dr. Milentis laugh. "Exactly like that," she agreed. "Except we're trying to preserve these bones for study, not for the afterlife." While the plaster dried, Dr. Debonis told me more about what they thought they'd found. The skull fragments suggested a creature larger than most known fossil apes from this time period, with features that seemed intermediate between modern apes and early human ancestors. The teeth were particularly interesting. They showed wear patterns that suggested a diet different from either modern apes or known early humans. "The problem with human evolution," he explained as we sat in the shade waiting for the plaster to cure, "is that we have very few fossils from the crucial period between 8 and 5 million years ago. This is when the human lineage probably split from our closest ape relatives, but the fossil record is frustratingly sparse. Every new discovery from this time period has the potential to completely change our understanding of how humans evolved. By late afternoon, the plaster jacket was ready for removal. Papa and Dr. Kelly worked together to carefully undercut the block, sliding shovels beneath it while Dr. DeBonis and Dr. Milenta steadied the sides. It was nerve-wracking work. One wrong move could damage fossils that had survived millions of years only to be destroyed in the last few feet of their journey to a laboratory. But finally, the block came free, and they carefully lifted it onto a wooden pallet lined with foam padding. The plaster jacket was about the size of a suitcase but much heavier, and it took all 4 adults to carry it to the truck. I felt oddly proud watching them load it up, even though I'd done little more than hold tools and ask questions. On the drive back to town, Dr. DeBonis explained what would happen next. The jacketed block would go to a laboratory where technicians would use tiny pneumatic tools and acid baths to slowly remove the surrounding rock, revealing the fossils inside. That process could take months or even years, depending on how much material they'd found and how well preserved it was. And then? I asked. Then we study it, he said. We compare it to other fossils, measure everything, try to figure out how it fits into the story of evolution. If we're lucky, we might even be able to give it a name, a scientific name that will go in textbooks and museum displays. The idea of naming a new species was incredibly exciting. I imagined some future version of myself walking through a natural history museum and seeing a display case with a skull labeled with a name I'd helped discover. It seemed like the closest thing to immortality a person could achieve. Over the next few weeks, I found myself thinking constantly about the fossils. Papa had returned to his regular duties with the Archaeological Service, but he brought home updates whenever he could. The initial preparation work at the laboratory had revealed that they'd indeed found substantial portions of a skull, along with teeth and jaw fragments from what appeared to be at least 2 individuals. Dr. DeBonis had been in contact with colleagues around the world, sharing photographs and preliminary descriptions. The response had been enthusiastic. Several experts thought the fossils might represent a previously unknown species, possibly even a new genus. If true, it would be one of the most significant paleontological discoveries ever made in Greece. But science, I was learning, moved slowly. Every claim had to be supported by evidence, every interpretation had to be tested against alternative explanations. The team would need to publish their findings in peer-reviewed journals, where other scientists would scrutinize their work and possibly challenge their conclusions. It could be years before the full significance of the discovery became clear. In the meantime, I tried to return to my normal summer routine, but everything seemed different now. When I played with friends in the neighborhood, I found myself looking at their faces and wondering what features had been passed down from ancient ancestors. When we visited the Archaeological Museum in Thessaloniki, I stared at the displays of ancient Greek pottery and bronze tools and thought about how recent they were compared to the fossils we'd found. Papa noticed my distraction and did his best to feed my new interest. He brought home copies of scientific journals with articles about human evolution, most of which were way over my head but contained fascinating illustrations and photographs. He also arranged for us to visit the university laboratory where the fossils were being prepared. The lab was everything I'd imagined and more, a bright, clean room filled with specialized equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. Technicians bent over microscopes, carefully removing tiny particles of sediment from fossil fragments with tools that resembled miniature jackhammers. The skull we'd discovered was laid out on a padded tray, and even partially prepared, it was clearly something special. Dr. Milentis gave us a tour, explaining the painstaking process of fossil preparation. Each fragment had to be cleaned slowly and carefully, with the technicians constantly checking to make sure they weren't removing actual bone along with the surrounding rock. Some areas were so delicate that they could only work for a few minutes at a time before stopping to rest their eyes and hands. "How long will it take?" I asked, watching a technician work on what appeared to be a tooth with a tool no bigger than a needle. "Months," Dr. Milentis replied. "Maybe longer. And that's just the preparation. Then we need to study everything, compare it to other fossils, write up our results." She shrugged. "Science takes time." But even in its partially prepared state, the skull was impressive. It was larger than I'd expected, with a robust brow ridge and large teeth that spoke of a powerful jaw. The bone was dark brown, almost black, and had a weight and solidity that made its age almost tangible. This creature had walked around northern Greece when the landscape was unrecognizably different, when the Mediterranean was smaller and the climate was tropical. As we prepared to leave the lab, Dr. Debonis pulled Papa aside for a quiet conversation. I caught only fragments, something about publicity and publications and the need to be careful about premature announcements. The discovery was attracting attention from international media, and there was pressure to make claims before the research was complete. "The problem," Dr. Debonis explained to me later, "is that everyone wants to know immediately whether we've found the missing link between apes and humans. But evolution doesn't work that way. It's not a straight line with convenient stopping points. Every species we discover fills in part of the picture, but there will always be gaps." I thought about this as we walked back to Papa's truck. The idea of evolution as a tree rather than a ladder was difficult to grasp, but it made sense in a way. Instead of a single line of ancestors leading directly to modern humans, there had been many different species trying different approaches to survival. Most had gone extinct, but each had contributed something to our understanding of how life changed over time. That evening, I sat on our balcony with one of Papa's scientific journals, trying to make sense of an article about primate evolution. The language was dense and technical, but the photographs were fascinating: skulls and teeth from dozens of different fossil species, arranged to show the gradual changes over millions of years. Each one represented a successful creature that had lived and reproduced and eventually died out, leaving behind only fragmentary clues about its existence. The article mentioned Ouranopithecus by name, describing it as a genus of fossil apes known from Greece and Turkey. The few previously discovered specimens suggested a large, robust primate that lived between 8 and 9 million years ago, right around the time when human ancestors were thought to have split from other apes. But the fossil record was frustratingly incomplete, mostly isolated teeth and jaw fragments that left enormous questions about what these creatures actually looked like and how they lived. Our discovery, if it proved to be Ouranopithecus, would be by far the most complete specimen ever found. It might finally provide answers to questions that had puzzled scientists for decades. Or it might raise entirely new questions that no one had thought to ask yet. The next few months passed slowly. School started again, and I found myself struggling to concentrate on my regular classes when my mind kept wandering to the fossils in the laboratory. My teachers noticed my distraction, and more than once I was caught doodling reconstructions of ancient apes in the margins of my notebooks instead of paying attention to lessons about modern Greek history or mathematics. But Papa continued to bring home updates about the discovery. The initial preparation had revealed that the skull was even more complete than they'd first thought, with preserved portions of the brain case that would allow scientists to estimate the creature's intelligence. Several of the teeth showed unusual wear patterns that suggested a diet different from any known fossil ape. Most importantly, certain features of the skull seemed to show a mosaic of ape and human-like characteristics. By winter, Dr. Debonis and his team were ready to begin writing their scientific paper. This was a crucial step. Until their findings were published in a peer-reviewed journal, the discovery would remain unofficial. Other scientists needed the opportunity to examine the evidence and offer their own interpretations. The paper would describe the fossils in excruciating detail, with measurements of every fragment and comparisons to dozens of other species. It would propose a name for the creature assuming it proved to be a new species and discuss its place in the evolutionary tree. Most importantly, it would make the case for why this discovery mattered to our understanding of human origins. What do you think they'll call it? I asked Papa one evening as we walked through our neighborhood. The streets were quieter now that summer was over, with families settled back into their regular routines. Something Latin, he replied with a smile. All scientific names are in Latin, even if the scientists don't speak the language. Usually they try to describe something about the creature, or honor the place where it was found, or sometimes the person who discovered it. The possibility that our discovery might be named after the region around Thessaloniki was exciting. Millions of years from now, if humans still existed, students might learn about Thessaloniki man or some Latin equivalent in their evolution classes. It was a way of making our corner of Greece part of the grand story of life on Earth. But naming was just the beginning. If the fossils proved to be as significant as Dr. Debonis believed, they would trigger a flood of new research. Other teams would want to search the same geological formations for additional specimens. The fossils would be studied using techniques that hadn't even been invented yet. Computer models would be built to understand how the creatures moved and what they ate. And somewhere in all of that future work, a 13-year-old boy who had held a brush and helped clear away ancient sediment would be a tiny footnote in the story. It wasn't much, but it was enough. By spring of 1976, the scientific paper was nearly finished. Dr. Debonis had shared drafts with colleagues around the world, incorporating their suggestions and addressing their concerns. The skull had been fully prepared and was now ready for detailed study. Photographs and measurements had been sent to other researchers for comparison with their own fossil collections. The emerging picture was remarkable. The creature they discovered was indeed a new species of Ouranopithecus, larger and more robust than any previously known fossil ape from this time period. Its brain was bigger than expected, suggesting a level of intelligence that bridged the gap between modern apes and early human ancestors. The teeth showed wear patterns that indicated a varied diet, possibly including some meat unusual for apes of this time period. Most intriguingly, certain features of the skull suggested that this creature might have been capable of walking upright, at least part of the time. This was controversial, since most scientists believed that upright walking evolved much later in human history. But the evidence was there in the shape of the skull base and the orientation of certain muscle attachment points. If they're right, Papa explained to me as we sat in our kitchen looking at photographs of the reconstructed skull, this could change how scientists think about human evolution. It might mean that upright walking evolved earlier than anyone thought, or that there were multiple experiments with bipedalism that didn't lead directly to humans. The implications were staggering. Instead of a neat, linear progression from ape to human, evolution was beginning to look like a messy, experimental process with lots of false starts and dead ends. Our discovery was just one piece of that puzzle, but it might be a crucial piece. As I stared at the photographs, I tried to imagine what this creature had been like when it was alive. Had it lived in family groups like modern apes? Did it use tools? Could it have been capable of simple communication or even primitive language? The skull could answer some of these questions, but others would require more discoveries, more pieces of the puzzle. The scientific paper was finally submitted for publication in late spring. Now came the waiting period while other scientists reviewed the work and decided whether it met the standards for publication. This peer review process could take months, and there was always the possibility that reviewers would find flaws or request additional research. But Dr. Debonis was confident. The discovery was solid, the interpretation was conservative, and the implications were profound. Even if some details were disputed, the basic finding that Ouranopithecus was more human-like than anyone had expected would stand. Meanwhile, word of the discovery was beginning to leak out to the broader scientific community and the press. Science journalists were calling the university, asking for interviews and photographs. Documentary filmmakers were expressing interest in the story. There was talk of a museum display that would allow the public to see the fossils for themselves. I found myself both excited and nervous about this attention. On one hand, it was thrilling to think that our little dig site might become famous around the world. On the other hand, I worried about what would happen when crowds of tourists started showing up, expecting to find more fossils just lying around on the surface. Papa shared my concerns. The problem with publicity, he said, is that it brings expectations. People will want every new discovery to be as important as this one, and that's just not how science works. Most of the time, you dig and find nothing, or you find fragments that raise more questions than they answer. But he also recognized the importance of sharing scientific discoveries with the public. Too often, research happened in isolation, with scientists talking only to other scientists. The discovery of a significant human ancestor belonged to everyone, not just to academics. That summer, exactly 1 year after our original discovery, the scientific paper was accepted for publication. Dr. Debonis called Papa with the news, and I could hear the excitement in his voice even through the crackling phone connection. The fossils would be officially described as Ouranopithecus macedonensis, honoring both the genus name that had been used for previous discoveries and the Macedonian region where they were found. The publication would appear in a prestigious international journal, ensuring that scientists around the world would read about the discovery. There would be a press conference, media interviews, and probably a celebration party for the research team. After months of careful work and patient waiting, the discovery was finally ready to enter the scientific record. I thought about that day a year earlier when I'd first held a brush and helped clear sediment away from what looked like nothing more than dark rocks in red dirt. None of us had known then what we were uncovering, but we'd all felt the excitement of discovery, the thrill of being the first people in millions of years to see what was hidden beneath the surface. Science, I had learned, was mostly about patience and careful observation. It was about being willing to spend months or years working on tiny details that might or might not prove important. It was about building knowledge slowly, one small discovery at a time, until a larger picture began to emerge. But it was also about wonder, the same wonder that had driven me to dig holes in our backyard, searching for buried treasure. The difference was that in real science, the treasure was knowledge itself, and it belonged to everyone who was curious enough to seek it. The press conference announcing the discovery was held at the University of Thessaloniki on a hot August afternoon. Papa and I sat in the back of a crowded auditorium, watching as Dr. Debonis and his colleagues presented their findings to an audience of scientists, journalists, and university administrators. They had prepared slides showing the fossils, comparisons to other species, and reconstructions of what Ouranopithecus macedonensis might have looked like when it was alive. The questions from the audience were technical and sometimes skeptical. Other scientists wanted to know about the dating methods, the statistical analyses, the possibility that the fossils might represent a known species rather than a new one. Dr. Debonis answered each question carefully, acknowledging uncertainties while defending his interpretations. One journalist asked whether this discovery proved that humans evolved in Europe rather than Africa, as most scientists believed. Dr. de Bonis was quick to clarify that one fossil, no matter how significant, couldn't overturn decades of research. Ouranopithecus macedonensis was probably a side branch on the evolutionary tree, not a direct human ancestor. But it showed that the story of human evolution was more complex than anyone had imagined. After the press conference, there was a reception where people could view casts of the fossils and ask more informal questions. I found myself standing next to a display case containing the reconstructed skull, still amazed that I had been present when these fragments were first uncovered. A small placard described the discovery and listed the members of the research team, including Papa's name as a field assistant. "Were you really there when they found it?" asked a young girl who couldn't have been much older than I was. She was studying the skull with the same fascination I remembered feeling. "Yes," I said, trying to sound casual. "I helped with the excavation." Her eyes widened. "What was it like? Did you know immediately that it was important?" I thought about how to answer. The truth was that the fossils hadn't looked like much at first, just dark shapes in red dirt that might have been rocks or roots or anything else. The importance had emerged slowly, through careful study and comparison and months of patient work. "It was exciting," I said finally, "but also kind of ordinary. Most of science is just being very careful and paying attention to details. The exciting discoveries happen because people are willing to do the boring work." She nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense. "I want to be a paleontologist," she said. "I want to find fossils too." I smiled, remembering my own excitement just over a year earlier. "Then you should start practicing," I told her. "Learn to observe carefully, to draw what you see, to ask good questions. And be patient, the best discoveries take time." As the reception wound down and people began to leave, I found myself standing alone with the display case, looking once more at the skull that had changed everything. In a few days, the original fossils would be carefully packed and shipped to a museum where they would be studied by scientists from around the world. Our quiet dig site would return to being just another hillside outside Thessaloniki, marked only by the careful notes in Dr. Kelly's field notebooks. But the discovery would live on in scientific papers and museum displays, in textbooks and documentaries, in the imagination of anyone curious about human origins. Ouranopithecus macedonensis would take its place in the growing family tree of human ancestors, helping to fill in one more piece of the puzzle of how we came to be. Papa appeared beside me, ready to drive home after a long and eventful day. "Well, Nikos," he said, "what do you think? Was it worth spending your summer vacation digging in the dirt?" I looked once more at the skull in its display case, thinking about all the work that had gone into bringing it from a hillside to this moment. The careful excavation, the months of preparation, the detailed analysis, the cautious interpretation, the rigorous peer review, all of it had been necessary to transform a collection of dark fragments into a scientific discovery that would outlast all of us. "Yes," I said simply. "It was worth it." As we walked out into the warm evening air, I was already wondering what other secrets might be hidden beneath the surface of familiar landscapes, waiting for someone curious enough and patient enough to find them. The earth was full of stories, Papa had always said, and we had just helped tell one of them. That seemed like a pretty good way to spend a summer.